Okay, good morning, Year 12. We are going to talk about the first few chapters of Stasiland, which is out of your comparative. So I hope the page numbers are the same on the ebook, alright, as they are on your hard copy. Here goes. So let's start with, my page will change, which it won't. Let's start with chapter 1, alright? So, don't forget to make a note of your contents page, alright? Make sure you pay attention to the date. In particular, you might want to note the starting date, alright, of 1996 and the end date of spring 2000, and the fact that she starts in Berlin in winter and she finishes in Berlin in spring. So maybe if we think about the seasons, winter is a time of sadness and tragedy, and it's cold and it's depressing and miserable. Whereas if we go to spring, we think of new life, new growth, happiness, and new beginnings, which I think is sort of a deliberate choice on Funda's behalf. Certainly the ending of the book, which we'll talk about at a later date, is fairly optimistic. She does suggest that despite all the tragedy that's happened for people like Miriam and Julia and Frau Paul, that there is hope yet. You've got your maps here of Germany. So remember we talked in class about West Germany, East Germany, alright, and then Funda has marked for you all these key places, alright, like Dresden, Leipzig, Potsdam, where Funda herself visits, okay? And then here you've got your image of the wall coming through here, dividing up Berlin, and you can see it even more clearly here, okay, the fact that you cannot access the West. Alright, so we start in Berlin, winter 1996. So the first thing I would say is take note, as I said before, of the time frame, 1996, alright? You might want to also take note of the setting. We're talking this week about setting. The crowds at Alexanderplatz station. So Funda starts her text at a train station, alright? Train stations are important because they're transitory, okay? They suggest that something is happening. I'm just going to see if I can highlight this for you, alright? So something is happening here. She is going somewhere. The whole idea of this too, the tone where it's sort of like, I'm hungover and I steer myself, and she's observing what happens. She observes a man from the wall, alright, zipping up his fly. It's like she's not part of this world. She is simply observing it, okay? And that's really important because we've got to remember that Anna Funda establishes herself as a visitor and an observer. She is still a journalist telling the stories. She reminds us continually that she is not German, she is Australian, alright? The second thing we need to say about this first page is that the setting and the strange things that happen and the slightly disconcerting nature of it, alright, like this man zipping up his fly, okay, and the fact that, she very much feels out of place, alright, the large woman in the bathroom, alright, these things all contribute to Funda feeling out of place, and this is really deliberate. She wants the reader themselves to feel a little bit disconcerted because this setting is actually preparing the reader for what they're going to encounter in the text itself, okay, which is things that are bizarre and disconcerting, alright? We might also note that Funda here feels a little bit uncomfortable, like this society is a little bit repressive. It doesn't seem welcoming or fun, does it? Especially not when she talks about arcs of cigarette butt and urine and, this strong description. I think she's trying to set East Germany up as maybe not such a welcoming place. Of course, all the lectures that we've listened to in the podcast, they all talk about how setting is really important in Stasiland, and I think she uses the setting here to make us feel a particular way. And I'm not sure about you, but when I started reading this book, I didn't actually enjoy the first few chapters. I really didn't enjoy the descriptions of Berlin, and I didn't connect with it, and I think that's deliberate. She wants us to feel that it's quite an oppressive society. Alright, The other thing I want to note is this casual use of German throughout. So just be prepared when you're reading to make sure you look up German words. So the one that I noticed on this page is Berliner Schnaut. All right, I thought that was really interesting. The fact that Funda deliberately chooses to include little snippets of German because she feels that there aren't words in English, just as in reverse there aren't words in German to describe the appropriate emotion or feeling, okay? And she talks about this attitude. She says, it's in your face. I don't want to stay here, but I don't want to go out into the cold either. All right, and again, we come back to the setting. She's talking about the smell of disinfectant, all right? The disinfectant smell is so strong, I can't tell whether I'm feeling sicker or better, all right? What else did I want to talk about? It's interesting that this woman who mans the bathrooms talks about the toilets, the Great Wall of China, and about her desire to travel. And sort of Miriam notes that she really doesn't believe this lady has any intention to travel. But it's interesting again because this is the first character we meet within the former GDR sort of thing. We are introduced to the character of Klaus, alright, he becomes significant later on. Remember, Klaus is like this former rock star that's sort of has his career and his band disformed by the Stasi because the Stasi don't agree with their music or their policies, okay? She talks about like her hangover and the synapses, and again, this is a way of her drawing the reader in and also establishing the outside. And I wondered when I read this little part here, I remember things that I haven't remembered before, things that do not come out of the ordered store of memories I call my past. I wonder if this is sort of representative of what happens in the interview she had with different characters, that they sort of remember things before. All right? I'm going to jump back and I'm going to also note the fact that this is up here the first reference of the wall, the first reference of the Berlin Wall, okay, which becomes almost like a character unto itself in the text, alright? And then the fact that she talks about it being built to keep people separate from one another. Again, this has connotations for later in the text. If we think of the story of Frau Paul and Torsten, her son, and the fact that this mother is separated from her son who's in hospital on the other side of the wall. Okay, so all these connotations, and I've actually marked this as where it says built to keep people separate from one another, an example of control, because ultimately that's what she's trying to do, okay? Let's talk about her feelings for the former Democratic Republic, alright? I think about the feeling I've developed for the former German Democratic Republic. It's a country which no longer exists, but here I am hurtling through it. It's rumble down houses and bewildered people. This feeling needs a stickle brick word. I can only describe it as horror romance, alright? The feeling I've developed for the former German Democratic Republic, alright? So you can already see the difference in intentions and ideology, alright? We can see that Funda is trying to make us see the former GDR in a particular way. She is certainly colouring our views as reader, alright? When she talks about tumble down houses and bewildered people, these are certainly not positive connotations. I wouldn't argue that tumble down and bewildered are necessarily negative connotations, but certainly she's painting a very interesting picture of this country. And then when she says horror romance, alright, which I've just marked for you, no, won't let me do it in a different colour. Alright, I think horror romance is quite important because again, it's about Funda using, I guess, artistic license, this idea that it's not just pure journalism and it's not pure fiction, all right, and we can choose sort of what word we use to describe this because it's a really interesting combination of the two, and horror romance is a word that she sort of decides on to describe it, okay? And then down here we have sort of the first flashback. I first visited Leafsag in 1994, nearly 5 years after the wall fell. Alright, so this is Funda establishing that she has certainly been here before, okay, and she has returned, and this becomes a bit of a thing, this whole idea of returning. She seems to return to East Germany 3 times, so she's there in her younger years as a student sort of thing. She comes back and takes the job at the television station because she wants to find out more about the story of Miriam, and then she comes back again in 2000 after she's gone home for 3 years because of the passing of her mother. She then comes back to Berlin one more time to see what it's all about and to sort of finalize this book. So it's a long time in the making, Stasiland, so I think we have to bear that in mind. I think it's interesting here that she calls it a communist dictatorship. Certainly not a positive connotation. She's pretty clear that she does not agree with what was happening. So 1994, 2 years later, I'm on my way back, so it's 1996 now that she's writing in, and we know this also because of our table of contents, which tells us that it's Berlin, it's winter, and it's 1996. We talked in class about the Runde Eck, alright, about what that was, the Stasi Museum, and we looked at some photos of that. You might want to go back to your Getting Knowledge Ready slides if you need to have a bit of a mental image. All round corner building, which had formerly been the Stasi offices. I needed to see for myself part of the vast apparatus that had been the East German Ministry for State Security. Remember we talked about the different roles that Funda plays and how she often puts herself in the text, how sometimes she's objective, how sometimes she's a character, alright? So that's really interesting to say that I needed to see for myself, alright? Then we have Funda's own definition of what the Stasi is here. She calls it an internal army. Again, pretty negative connotation when she says army, alright? And then we also discussed in class the idea of negative connotations with the word metastasize. She talks about it almost like it is a disease when she says it metastasized through East German society, overt or covert. And again, this control of language, she's not objective. She's colouring up observations. I mean, she's trying to make readers see it as a very negative thing, or at least something that certainly had drastic consequences for the world of the people that we do meet in the text, okay? The signals for observation here, I really think this is, for Funda, an example of humour, alright? I certainly laughed at this when I was reading it. We discussed the fact that parts of this book are supposed to be funny, okay? So it's quite deliberate. And then especially here when she says, I pictured the street ballet of the deaf and dumb agents signaling to each other, corner to corner, striking noses, tummies, backs and hair, trying and untying shoelaces, lifting their hats, alright, to strangers and rifling through pages. A choreography for very nasty scouts, alright? And here we have also the fact that she's beginning to really explore more of what the GDR was, and I've written in my book that Funda explores parts of the former GDR with emotions ranging from wonderment to confusion, alright? It's humorous, it's wonder, it's confusing. We're beginning to become encased in the world of the Stasi, you know, and she's setting us up to understand some of this world before we meet the character of Miriam, so that we can sort of understand the world that Miriam's living in order to better understand her story, alright? Then we have the smell sampling, alright, which again I think is a use of humour on Funda's behalf. I mean, it seems absurd. She talks about being like Alice in Wonderland and like everything being topsy-turvy. And smell sampling is almost like, the potions in Alice in Wonderland where she goes bigger or smaller. It's all really quite absurd and fantastical, and yet this was the reality under the Stasi, all right? We have our first reference to Miriam, all right, who is mentioned to Funda by Frau Holitzer. So remember, Frau just means Mrs. So she's the lady who runs the museum, all right? And all we know about Miriam at this point is she's a young woman, all right, whose husband had died in the Stasi remand cell, all right? So we're sort of intrigued. And here she says, I went home to Australia, but I'm now back in Berlin. I could not get Miriam's story, the strange second-hand tale of a woman I had never met, out of my mind. I found a part-time job in television and set about looking for some of the stories from this land gone wrong. I said, well, we've sort of been introduced to Miriam, so we're starting to be intrigued, maybe would be a good, intrigued to be a good word to use. So we're keen to keep going. And I've just said too here that the opening chapter introduces us to Funda, through whose eyes we view the events. So we can't affect that just as we see 1984 through or from the perspective of Winston Smith, we see Stasiland from the perspective of Anna Funda, and both colour our perception. Chapter 2, Miriam. Miriam is a victim. You might want to make a note on your book that Miriam is a victim. Remember, we talked in class about making sure that we were clear who plays what role. And if you're struggling with this, it's on the Getting Knowledge Ready slides, and it's also on those revision slides that I've got pinned up in my classroom. Otherwise, they're also on the Google Classroom, the website, etc. Remember, the resources are out there. Someone said it really well the other day. You could teach yourself this. Truly, Year 12, you can teach yourself this. The main thing is just that you do put the time and effort into understanding. Let's talk about Miriam. She's a tragic hero. What do I mean by tragic hero? She doesn't mean to be heroic, and her story is pretty sad. I remember Miriam's story is all about how a 16-year-old became the enemy of the state, and that Miriam's story is really how Anna Funda came to undertake this whole job of writing this book. She says in the interviews at the Melbourne Writers' Festival that initially she was just going to tell Miriam's story, and then she realised that to do justice to Miriam's story, she needed to do a whole lot more. We're introduced to the people that Miriam is working with, including her boss, who becomes significant because of his sort of attitude when she asks about telling the story of the East German people, all right? So the boss is Schaller, and then Yu Schmidt is his sort of assistant or secretary of some description, all right? And again, we've got this really intriguing description of them on behalf of Funda. I mean, if this was just pure journalism, she probably wouldn't tell us about these people, but she wants to, because she wants us to sort of understand her life in Germany and the people that she meets and what she comes across and how this story ends up becoming relevant. The puzzle women are mentioned first here, all right? And they are important, of course, because remember, Miriam later is still hoping that the puzzle women will piece together what happened to Charlie, her late husband, because that's still shrouded in mystery. And so the puzzle women are the ones that are trying to put back the files, because of course the Stasi kept files and everything, and then at the end they couldn't possibly have destroyed it all. All right. We have this conversation about the letter that she gets, all right, and it says, I agree with him, all right, whether we might do an item on East German people, all right, interesting. And I've said here with the puzzle women and doing an item on East German people, it's the first time we begin to see this idea broached of reconstructing history and looking at the GDR, all right, and what happened. Funda here down the bottom says there must be people who stood up to the regime somehow or who were wrongfully imprisoned. All right. again, it's like what she hopes to do. I've called it the preamble. It's how Funda came to tell these stories, alright? It's almost, it's what she tells through Miriam and Julia and Frau Paul and Charlie. And then she goes that step further and she tells the other side by interviewing the variety of different Stasi men, both sympathetic and unsympathetic, okay? When her boss says no one is interested in these people, I said that this is the attitude of everyone in Germany. It's sort of still too soon to be talked about. No one here is interested. They were backward and they were broke, the whole Stasi thing. It's sort of embarrassing. Again, still no one wants to talk about. And we mentioned in class in the first week that, so many people in Germany weren't willing, even in 2010, to receive Funda's book. Alright, it might have seen success in other countries, but in the former GDR, it's still very much a no-go zone, which is really interesting that they're just not willing to look back at their past sort of things. And then the man who writes to her in the first place writes back, alright, to her, and he's quite angry or irate. He wrote back a week ago, he was angry, telling me history is made of personal stories. I really love this history is made of personal stories. I think that's a great way to put it, and that is exactly what Funda does. So it's almost like this moment here, this letter that she receives, is the encouragement that Funda needs to continue to search for these stories, okay? Then we come back to Miriam on the train, alright, and she's going to meet, Anna on the train, and she's going to meet Miriam for the first time, okay? So we've got these changes in time frame, alright, but we seem to understand that they're happening because of the way Funda writes, okay? And this time we've gone back from being personal, alright, so here is personal, this is more objective. Again, she's more of an observer as she meets Miriam and they drive through Leipzig or Leipzig, alright? We get our first description of Miriam's apartment, which is really important. It's like she is like like a damsel in distress, but now she's sort of like a maiden in her tower, like looking at everyone. And Funda says from here you could see anyone coming. Of course, this is really significant because Miriam's lived a whole life of people being after her, alright? People coming for her and for her husband. So this becomes significant later on. And then Miriam says, I officially became an enemy of the state at 16, which again, it's this absurdity, like what can a 16-year-old do, honestly? And then we have her story, and it's, just about some pamphlets that are distributed, alright, and the fact of the matter is that the Stasi did not like this, and she basically ends up being imprisoned and tortured, and she ends up having to suffer sleep deprivation and all of this also. Through this ordeal, she also tries to escape into the West, okay. It talks about a widespread feeling of malaise, alright. Here it is, for the expression of widespread malaise. So you might not know what that means. So that is basically saying or suggesting that there's a general feeling of discomfort, alright? So that at this time when Miriam's a teenager, there's a feeling of discomfort with everything that's sort of going on in the world, alright? And she's not super happy, and as a 16-year-old, she sort of tries to do something about this. So they make leaflets. The two of them decide to do something about that. Miriam and Ursula made leaflets, alright? It's these leaflets that are sort of the beginning of the end for Miriam, alright? Because they basically get caught, and it, you know, again, Funda is trying to impact how we as readers view it, because she says it seems so harmless, I say. And then Miriam replies, quiet but strong, at that time it was not harmless, it was the crime of sedition. Alright, sedition means inciting the people to rebel against the authority of the state. So again, this comes back to that control that they have over the people. What else? We've got the fact that neither would admit anything. We thought we'd been so careful, thrown out everything, destroyed the all the evidence, but the Stasi found some of the little rubber letters, alright? And then eventually Miriam says, just like fiction, they break you. They told each of us the other had admitted, so we might as well too. After no visits, no books, nothing. You think, well, she probably did say it. Alright. And then we end this with the girls are placed in, sorry, I should have noted that the girls are placed in solitary confinement. A bit harsh, again, looking at 16-year-olds being placed in solitary confinement for a month because of some pamphlets that they make at home with some stamps. And then we get to New Year's Eve 1968, alright, and Miriam Webber was going over the wall, and that's where that ends. And then we have to question, of course, whether going over the wall is courage or not. Chapter 3, the Bornholm Bridge. Again, this is about the victims, because this is Miriam's attempt to escape. Alright, so make sure you note that this chapter is victims, and Bornholm, of course, is named after the Bornholm Bridge station, which is where Miriam gets out at in an attempt to flee. Flee is the best word I can think of. She wants out. Okay, she doesn't want to be in the GDR anymore. She knows if she stays, nothing good's going to happen. So she's this brave 16-year-old, and basically she decides she's going to leave, and she comes very close to being successful. It almost seems a little bit absurd, and Funda positions us to see it a little bit absurd, alright, because of the way she decides to go over the wall. She rummages around in someone's tool shed, put it up against a hedge, climbed up it. She took a good long look around. Seems all too easy, alright? And this is the problem that the Stasi later have as well, alright? That it's just a bit too easy. And again, it's the intelligence of Miriam, and it's her bravery that we have to note, alright? And of course, we are positioned to see this bravery because Funda tells her story almost with a sense of wonderment, okay? About the fact that, you know, the Eastern Century huts, and then down here she sort of comes back to herself in the present, and she says, this is Funda. I sit in the chair, exploring the meaning of dumbstruck, rolling the word around in my mind. I laugh with Miriam, she laughs at herself. And the boldness, alright? Again, this is quite a positive. You could argue that Miriam was quite stupid at the time. At 16, you're invulnerable. I laugh about her rummaging around in a ladder for other people's shed. I laugh harder when she finds one. We laugh at the improbability of us, of someone more than a child poking around in Beatrix's spot a garden by the wall. Again, Beatrix Potter, you know, little Peter Rabbit, the rascally rabbit who gets up to no good. It makes it seem very innocent and childlike. Again, so Funda's positioning the reader so that in the next chapters when we find out what happens to Miriam, we see it as unjust and unfair. We do not see her as an enemy of the state. We have the story of the escape, alright? And the dog that doesn't see her, alright? And the fact that the dog walks away and Miriam thinks she's safe for a time being, but then eventually she hits a tripwire, alright? Unfortunately, and then she is captured, alright? And she's taken to the Berlin Stasi headquarters, so all of a sudden things have gone from bad to worse because now she's going to be you know, accused of trying to flee, I suppose is the word. Like, and they talk about the fact that you can apply to leave, but like it's still like a crime to actually go through with it in any way. Maybe not that dissimilar to what we're having issues with today with regards to asylum seekers, just as a side note. But they hadn't really seen me, no one has seen me. She came so close. Nostalgia, maybe for a tone there. It's like Funda herself is nostalgic for what could have been achieved. And even when it says up here, I did not see the wire, it's almost like, oh, she came so close, she deserved to flee. Like, again, we really feel, as readers, we're like, oh, that sense of what could have been. We're positioned to see Miriam as a character here. She feels sympathy for the dog, you know, she talks all these years later about the dog, you know, they probably demoted that dog, poor thing, she says, either that or shot him. You know, this girl's 16, she's trying to escape, she's in police custody, all the things that have happened, and she still thinks of the dog. She feels sympathy for others, and I've put this as love and connection because Funda definitely wants us as a reader to connect with this character of Miriam, okay? What else? No telephone calls, no lawyers. Sleep deprivation. Is this torture? Funda sort of suggests that maybe yes it is. Alright, and then she says the interrogation of Miriam Weber took place every night for 6 hours between 10 and 4 a.m. Alright, she slept for 2 hours. She was not permitted to sleep during the day. All of this is the cruelty of the Stasi to deprive a child of sleep, you know. And here it says sleep deprivation can mimic symptoms of starvation, alright? And it's the language is so negative here, becoming locked in an interminable presence, so forever being stuck, you know, neurological dysfunctions. Funda is really here quite critical of the Stasi, and of course we know that later on we actually see that this episode is wiped from Miriam's file, because even in the GDR, sleep deprivation, or at least they say sleep deprivation of a child, is frowned upon. Alright, and then Funda says, Miriam says, I cannot explain how kaput it makes you. Alright, so she's very much recalling that she was not well at the time. She was really struggling with the sleep, alright? And then she decides to come up with a story, more or less, because she has to find a way to get them to leave her alone for a little while. So what does the human spirit do after 10 days without sleep and 10 days of isolation? It dreams up a solution, alright? Because of the fact that they do not believe her. For the Stasi, it was beyond comprehension. Alright? What else? So Miriam makes up this story, alright, about how she escaped, and she gives them what they wanted. And then she talks about going to Orbach's cellar, eating goose fat rolls, alright, and she makes up this really elaborate story. But ultimately this just sort of drives them crazy, alright, because Orbach's cellar, we see here, is a famous institution, alright, so it's a well-known place, so it seems reasonably viable. Again, this speaks to Miriam's intelligence. And then the walls and ceilings are painted and covered in dark painted scenes with ghosts, Faust meeting Mephistopheles. Alright, so Faust is a literary character who makes a pact with the devil, so it's all very what's the word? Relevant or ironic that she would choose a pub that's all about making a pact with the devil sort of thing. I was going to say on this page too, this is the story that Miriam told Stasi, just like Winston ends up in the book, just confessing to everything. He just doesn't care anymore, just like Miriam. They just want to get out. They just want to be left alone. And then we have this sort of conversation between Miriam and Anna, and it's about the level of surveillance, alright, within the GDR, because here Miriam explains gently the GDR, it was inconceivable a person was asked a stranger, alright, so it's like this idea that you can't trust anyone in the GDR, much like in 1984 where Winston can't trust a single person, and those that you do trust end up betraying you, alright. Miriam thought he must be crazy. And then the guard says, never let it be said that we don't give you a fair go. Later it was clear to Miriam he'd been protecting himself. Had she been asked in court why she invented such a story, she simply would have said sleep deprivation amounted to torture, etc., at least of minors. It was not official policy. Alright, makes sense. And in the final line of this chapter, they were all crazy and they were all locking her up. Again, this sense of justice, it's not fair. Chapter 4, I think Miss Brooks did this, but I'll just do the start for you. So we have Charlie here. Charlie, of course, is a victim of the Stasi, alright, and the chapter is named after Miriam's husband, who saves her after she is changed by prison, and it's all about the brutal treatment of Miriam in prison and then her life after, and how it just keeps going. In the first sentence is, when I got out of prison I was basically not human. We could compare this to 1984, of course, because when Winston comes out of room 104, he is basically a changed man, alright? The love that he had for Julia is gone, alright? What else? Oh, she talks about it being the only time she ever thought she would die, alright? The first day at Hot Neck, that's the jail, Miriam thought she would die. So again, this cruelty, she's still only 16 at this point, and she's basically suffocating. She says that she thought they would kill her, alright? And this is just a child that we're talking about, a child who made some pamphlets and then tried to get over the wall, and they're almost trying to break her. And of course we are then positioned to sympathise with her, because Funda says her voice is stretched and I can't look at her. We feel bad, we feel this overwhelming sympathy, alright? And then just on the next page, it's just a little bit more about the apartment, alright? Prison left me with some strange tics. She's taken off all the doors in all the apartments she's lived since. It's not that she has anxiety attacks about small spaces. She says it's just that she starts to sweat and go cold. This apartment is perfect for me, alright? So, again, this connects back to what we were talking about earlier, about the fact that she could see everything, she could see anyone coming from up here. And I've also noticed that it's a little bit about the courage to keep living, and again we're positioned because Funda says, and we want to keep reading as readers as well, alright, because Funda says, I think of what is still to come, alright, and so again this sympathy that we are positioned to feel. I'm going to leave it at that. That's the first 34 odd pages of your book done. Miss Brooks has also got a screencast, okay? You've got the podcast, if you just Google Stasiland in podcast either in your iTunes account or on your phone, okay? Have a listen to that and be confident to do some annotating yourself, plus what we talked about in class. Remember that this week you should have read the first 50 pages of both texts. You should have annotated them, and this week we're actually going to start writing a small comparison, and we're going to look at the setting. So you might want to think about the setting of Stasiland compared to the setting of 1984. What's the same and what's different? Alright, thanks for listening.